Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Booker Prize podcast with me, James Walton.
Me, Joe Hamia.
And today, the big news is that we've got the first of a two-part special on this year's International Booker Prize shortlist.
As you may know, the International Booker Prize is the Booker Prize's sister award for the best fiction from anywhere in the whole world that's been translated into English, with the £50,000 prize shared between the author and the translator. Last year's winners, for example, were Georgi Gospodinov and Angela Rodel for Time Shelter, the first Bulgarian novel to win, and you may have even heard James and I interviewing them both for the podcast last December, which I really enjoyed a lot. I remember vividly James asking Angela why, in one particular passage, of all the words for penis, she'd chosen the word pecker.
Yeah, you can always rely on me to raise the tone, I like to think. But Joe, before we get down to International Booker Prize business today, it's been a while since we last crossed microphones.
So some of you may notice that I am a bit husky.
You were a bit ill, which is why this one is going out a week later than planned. But apart from being a bit ill, what have you been up to, and are you okay now? There's a bit of a cough going on there, I hear.
Yes, so I'm almost recovered, almost.
Yeah.
But on the upside, I've got this really great husky voice thing going on.
Yeah.
It's made less sexy by the fact that intermittently I have to stop and cough my guts out. But I published my novel very recently, my second book, and you came to the launch, which was really lovely of you.
I did. It was really great. The book's called The Hypocrite, which not entirely irrelevant to my book because I haven't read it. So I felt a bit of a hypocrite coming to, but I will do. Maybe even by the time this podcast goes out.
And now on to the International Prize.
Maybe that's enough top bants for now, actually, Joe. So let's do that International Booker Prize shortlist.
Yeah.
Starting with a reminder, stroke the news, depending on how clued up you are, of what's on it. And the 6 books are, in alphabetical order of authors:
Not a River by Selva Almada, translated by Annie McDermott.
A Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck, translated by Michael Hoffman.
The Details by Ia Gunberg, translated by Kira Yusufson.
Meta 2-10 by Hwan Sok Young, translated by Sora Kim Russell. And Young Jai Josephine by What I'd Rather Not Think About by Yenta Postuma, translated by Sarah Timmer Harvey.
Crooked Plough by Itamar Vieira Junior, translated by Johnny Lorenz.
So, Joe, as we'll discover as we go through them, that's 6 different countries and 6 different languages represented.
Yeah.
What did you make of the shortlist in general?
I really, really enjoyed it, and I was slightly disappointed in a kind of, national pride kind of sense to not see White Nights by Ursula Honeck and translated by Kate Webster on the shortlist, because I am half Polish, for anyone who's literally just joined us for this episode. But other than that, because I was ill, I read these all in bed, like one by one in succession, in this like really weird dazed state. And maybe it's just me, but I felt there was this running thread of maybe memory or recovery going through these books of characters trying to reclaim the past, whether it was through their ancestry or whether it was through their country's history or whether it was just in a very, very personal way through the people that they'd met. And the first book I started with was The Details by Ia Gunberg, which very weirdly enough opens with the sentence, "After a few days of the virus in my body, I come down with a fever, which is followed by an urge to return to a particular novel." And I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience because I had a virus and I was slightly feverish. But it just set the reading up so nicely.
Yeah, in fact, she talks about that when you read a book with a fever, it can either wash over you or actually go sort of deeper because you're in this sort of weirdly heightened state.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to find out which of those statements is true.
I really enjoyed the shortlist too, and I think it did what the International Book is meant to do, which is sort of expand your mind and remind you that the world's bigger than you thought.
Yes.
Like there's one, the book Meta 2-10, which we'll come on to, by Hwan Sok Young, says, trouble with Korean literature, there's never been much about industrial workers. And I must admit, this has never been a lack I've ever felt particularly keen. and yet you suddenly realise, oh yeah, that opening up of the mind really does work. The South American book set in pretty remote parts of the country, which most of us will not have known about and yet vividly bring to life. Also, we'll come on to all of this, but what it's like to live in East Germany, which I was interested in already.
Yeah.
But I'm even more interested in now. I also thought there were some quite interesting differences between European and the South Americans and Korean books, which I don't know. I mean, obviously, ghosts and spirits are there in the books that aren't from Europe, but
Mm,
also a more communal sense. They're more books about we,
mm,
whereas the European ones are more about I.
mm.
And obviously, it sounds like I'm stereotyping, but definitely that sort of European individualism, for good or ill, comes across versus slightly more communal experiences elsewhere.
I think there is some overlap. Obviously, it's kind of. I think it's maybe like folly. Just from the outset, we should both say this. It's kind of folly to try and create like a neat line of comparison
It is, yeah.
between these six novels. They are joined by the fact that our judges this year have particular interests and tastes. But it's not a perfect art,
No,
so
it's
by
not.
all
No.
means. But I think there is like a little bit of overlap. Like what I'd rather not think about, which we're going to get onto in this episode later, is this very prolonged meditation on the death of the narrator's twin brother, and he becomes kind of a ghost in the book, even though he's
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
to her
yeah.
through her memories. He's definitely a ghost, and the same with Kairos. Actually, the book starts out on the narrator Katerina unpacking boxes after her former lover has died, and he's, even though we're reading a kind of you know ostensibly present tense account of their relationship, we know at the beginning of the book that he's already dead. So I felt like there was this very kind of ghostly
No,
thread
that's
running
right.
through all of these books.
We've talked before, really, about the process of, I think, of what were once sort of external ghosts and spirits becoming internal, and I think
Yes.
they're becoming more internal in the European books. But anyway, maybe we should get down to business. So we've got 6 books to do, and we've got 2 episodes to do them. How are we going to split them?
So we are we're going to split them because they are actually all quite alike and yet somehow not alike
No.
at all. We've decided to go for very basic geography. So in this episode, we will be focusing on the European authors. We'll be talking about The Details by Ia Genberg, Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck, and What I'd Rather Not Think About by Jente Postuma. And then in our second episode, we will be moving on to the Korean and South American authors and novels. So Crooked Plough, Not a River, and Meta 2-10.
Okay.
That's the best way we could think to do
Yeah,
it.
it's
And
not massively imaginative, but it just did seem to work.
yeah.
And also, I take your point that pretending there's a massive link between all the books is tempting, and there are links, but we'll try not to force them too much.
Yes, I think it would be really interesting to. Unfortunately, we can't let this podcast run for 2 hours
Oh,
for one episode. But I think it would be really interesting to compare, for example, something like Kairos to Meta 210 in terms of how it evokes a particular point in history and how it evokes a kind of communist state versus a kind of more capitalist
well, they're both
state.
about divided countries, aren't they?
Yeah.
Germany and Korea.
And it would be really interesting to compare What I'd Rather Not Think About with Not a River and its kind of evocations of death, or, gradually meditating on the loss of a character. So Eusebio and Not a River, and the twin brother and What I'd Rather Not Think About. But unfortunately, we've had to split it up somehow.
Yeah, no, we have. So why don't you kick us off with Kairos?
So Kairos is written by Jenny Erpenbeck and translated by Michael Hoffman. Jenny Erpenbeck is a writer, but also an opera director, which I think is actually incredible. And I think it kind of shows in the prose of Kairos. But we'll move on to that in a sec. Her name is one of those that is kind of bandied about on betting lists for the Nobel Prize every year. And this is the first book of hers that I've read. And now I completely understand why. So Kairos itself is principally set in the 80s in Germany. Well, at the point where there is still, the Berlin Wall is still up, and there
Yes.
is still a divide between East Germany and West
And
Germany.
this is very much East Germany, isn't it? She lives in East
Yes,
Berlin, yeah.
we sometimes travel with our main character Katerina to other countries and once to West Germany, but we stay principally in the East. And she, one day when she is 19, meets by chance Hans at a bus stop. They happen to have gotten the same bus at the same day, and they like the look of each other. Hans is 34 years older than her. Is that right?
That's, I think so. She's 19 and he's
I did
he's
do the maths on
54.
this.
So
Yeah.
and they've got this big thing in the early days of their relationship when everything, and then mythologizing their relationship as people tend to do. The fact that she was born in 67 and he was born in 33,
Yeah.
and that adds up to 100.
Yes.
It becomes a kind of weirdly big deal for them.
Yes, it becomes a weirdly big deal for them. And there's this moment where he says, he's looking at her talking to boys her own age, and he says, "Oh, but their ages wouldn't add up to 100. It's just me and her who do," which seems sweet. But as the book progresses, the relationship sort of begins to fall apart quite spectacularly. So, Katerina, her frontal lobe develops ever more as the book goes on, and she thinks in the end that she might like to travel, go to college, work. Eventually she does kind of move away to work in a theatre company, and she ends up having a relationship with another boy who's closer to her own age, which Hans doesn't take too kindly, but it's sort of hypocritical because he himself is a married man.
I'm married with possibly at least one of them mentioned
Yes.
every now and
Oh,
then.
like at least two.
Yeah, but how dare she?
Yes, but how dare she? And he sort of takes her back benevolently, but in a very kind of emotionally abusive way. And while this is happening, Eppenberg is giving us this account of the GDR beginning to crumble, and we kind of know as surely as Hans and Katharina will break up that the Berlin Wall will come down. And he, I suppose, represents the past. He was a former member of the Nazi Party, and he finds
Hitler Youth, which was hard to
yeah,
avoid.
Hitler Youth, I suppose.
But yes, but he was still around.
But I
But
very much got the sense
was
that
his father was a full on Nazi.
yeah,
It seems.
I was about to say I very much got the sense that there was a kind of mourning in him for the days of a fascist government. So I suppose he represents a kind of old, kind of more communist minded, or at least socialist, weirdly minded Germany, whereas Katharina represents a kind of westernized perspective, a more kind of individual outlook, not the we but the I, who believes in buying expensive clothes or eating aubergines, which you can't find in East Germany at the time. And I don't think that the political events of the 80s in Germany are an exact metaphor for Hans and Katharina's relationship, but there is a very nice kind of parallel. There's this really great way that Eppenbeck has of kind of fluidly moving from sentence to sentence between how Hans or Katharina feel and what is going on in the country at the time, that I found very gratifying to read.
Yeah, no, me too. And that was it was never clumsy, was it? The parallels between
No.
the two of them. I mean, occasionally the bit where he sort of takes her back and puts her on under surveillance, he is quite Stasi-like, and she's sort of put on a sort of a bit of a show trial. But that's making it sound much cruder than it is. It's far more suggestive than that. I think a bit harsh on him. He was in Hitler Youth, but he didn't have much choice. His dad was a Nazi, but he chose to come to East Germany because he felt that East Germany was the anti-Nazi state in a way that the West Germany wasn't, which is sort
That's
of
true.
true. The first Chancellor of West Germany abandoned denazification after a while because he was desperate to get back sort of in with the West. And that sort of kernel of idealism that was at the heart of East Germany at the beginning, he has too. So that's another way in which he's sort of East Germany.
That's true. But then what did you make of the kind of S&M stuff where, he becomes quite fond of kind of, using a belt on Katerina or tying her. There's a scene where he ties her to the bed and then he goes to the kitchen while she's tied to the bed and he just leaves her, he smokes a cigarette and she's there wondering when will he come back. And that was a very weird...
Yeah, well, again, it's easy to make parallels. So the crudest way of reading that, I thought, was in a way, she was the sort of East German people sort of masochistically accepting this. But the Czech writer Milan Kundera says at one point that that when Russia did what it did to our country, to Czechoslovakia, it sort of did it out of love or pretend love, that this was something that was motivated by a sort of rather sentimental love. And he's quite sentimental in his love for her too, while mistreating her. So that was another possibility.
Yes.
I mean, also a thing that fascinates me about East Germany is that it lasted longer than the First World War, the Weimar Republic, the entire Nazi period, and the Second World War all put together, and yet it's dismissed as this weird sort of blip that really didn't exist. It was, what even was it?
Yeah.
And it was a country that lasted that long. And I think one of the things that this book does is tries to remind us that East Germany was a place in which people built lives for 40 years. Recreates the cafes, the restaurants, the pop stars, the famous writers, all of whom were completely wiped out at the end.
Yeah.
So when the Berlin Wall falls, she's very strong on the idea of how brutal that was. So Hans, who's working for a local radio station, so he's dismissed along with all the other 13,000 employees of the broadcasting services of a state that no longer exists.
Yeah.
And not them, the sound engineers, the dancers, the editors, the dentists from the clinic, the kindergarten teachers from daycare, the presenters, researchers, camera people, and of course the likes of him, scriptwriters, journalists, composers, directors, regular freelancers. They're all gone because they were a servant of a country that just suddenly stopped.
This leads me to rehash a debate that we had when we discussed Sally Rooney's Normal People, where we were trying to decide whether it was a romantic novel with politics attached or whether it was a political novel with romance attached. And I think that same kind of question can be asked of Kairos. And I was wondering what your verdict was this time round.
In this one, I think it manages an unbelievably subtle and perfect balance between the two things.
And that's down to the prose style as well, which is so sort of fluid. So a lot of this book is told, or most of this book is told in a kind of present tense, which usually feels so intimate. But in this case, that does, and Hoffman's translation does such a great job at creating this kind of poetry without sentimentality at all. So that you do feel kind of slightly distanced, and yet you care both about the relationship and about East Germany. So there's this great moment where Hans finds out that Katharina has cheated on him. And it sounds mad, but somehow, like you say, there's this perfect balance between the political and the romance in the novel. So he's about to find out something that will absolutely crush their relationship. And you'd think that the prose would center entirely on him and his thoughts. But instead, what we get is, in February 1956, Khrushchev speaks for the first time about Stalin's crimes. In March 1956, Brecht, who Hans is kind of obsessed with, falls ill. In August, he dies. The Stalinale in Berlin is renamed Karl-Marx-Allee. Someone picks up the disdained name and throws it over a low wall into the adjoining yard where the brown shirt also lies. There are 3 weeks between the night Katharina spent in the studio and the day she hurries out to buy some cake, while Hans is ferreting about for an empty bit of scrap paper to write down the name Tretyakov. He finds one, but it has some writing on it. And the writing is a kind of note that Katharina had made about sleeping with a friend called Van Damme or Van Damme. And it's so great because somehow it's distant, but it's not.
Yeah. And the resonances between the two, rather than crude parallels, as I say, both of them are paid full attention to. So it actually starts off quite rom-com, actually.
It really does.
They've got a meet cute. They have their first sex to sort of classical music at the vital time. she early on, she thinks of Hans and the way he crinkles up his nose when he's reading something he likes. For his part, he's fond of Katharina's little nose, the way it quivers when she's aroused. And so it sounds, but then of course it all sort of darkens and darkens and darkens. My only wonder about this is the second half becomes quite repetitive. He just beats away at her and tells her, keeps telling her, or sends her cassettes actually about
Side A, side B, 60 minutes.
Listen to just all the terrible things you are and why you're not worthy of my love and why you're terrible. And she sort of dutifully listens to and responds to it and sort of pleads guilty to in a, you could regard a sort of show trial way. But that goes on for ages. And towards the end, was there no part of you thinking, oh, just split up already, just break up already? The book's made its point, and let's get on to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Come on.
I didn't. And I know that you have a kind of more political theory about why it takes so long, because I think I remember you saying that essentially it was like the parallel between these tapes going on and on and on and on is kind of like, East Germany struggling and running out of steam eventually, but it taking too long. But to me, the Hans's kind of relentlessness in bringing Katharina down, and it's not just via the tapes, it's also by a kind of coldness that he shows to her in person.
Interspersed in the classic way with moments of kindness as well.
Yes. I found it, I was actually so glad that it went on for as long as it did. Not because I wanted Katharina to be abused in any way, but because it was such an honest account and realistic account of what an emotionally abusive relationship is like. It does go on for on and on and on. Actually, I think this is a great time to play a clip from one of our actor readings, this time done by Eleanor Tomlinson, which I think shows really well the kind of point at which the mind games start with Hans and how tragic this is for Katerina.
Yeah, if only it was though, Joe. I mean, there's plenty more where that came
Yeah,
from.
there's
That's
way
her
more.
visiting. He's visiting her where she's doing her theatre studies,
Yeah.
and then immediately goes back. But he's that's only a tiny bit of his mind games. But maybe we should leave Kairos there, shall we?
Yeah, we should leave it behind, but really, really loved it. I think this is like one of the top of the pile overall on the shortlist.
I must say that
for
the
me.
bit I've prepared lots of stuff. The bit I haven't prepared is who do you think should win at the end of episode 2, because it's really hard.
No, well, I think it's great. We can talk and then
Yeah.
we'll organically come to that
Exactly.
conclusion.
We'll be like the judges themselves. Let me introduce then the details by Genberg, translated by Kira Josephson. So Genberg was born in Stockholm, Sweden, 1967. Began her writing career as a journalist, and in fact, didn't publish her first novel until 2012 when she was 45. Details is her third novel, the first to be translated into English, and was a massive bestseller in Sweden. And as you mentioned, it starts with the unnamed narrator having fever, having a fever, a COVID fever. And it reminds her of having a fever after returning from East Africa once with malaria when she read Paul Auster's The New York Trilogy. So she starts reading it again.
There are a
That's-
lot of literary references.
There's a lot of
yeah.
books in this book, yeah. It's got an inscription from Johanna in the front of it, and she turns out to have been an ex-lover. So she talks about her fever, and she says at a certain point, it's not unpleasant if you can, quote, bear to have the past slinking around your legs like dogs. And that's sort of what happens in this slightly heightened fever state. She remembers successively 4 people in 4 different sections. So the first is Johanna, her former lover, from when she was 27 in 1996. Couldn't imagine a time when they're not together, but then they have a brutal breakup.
Yes.
Then there's Nikki, who's quite a disturbed friend, really, sort of full of love and hate. She says of her, I think, rather brilliantly, that she was an ocean of feelings with more gradients and nuances than she could handle, as if the full cast of Greek gods and all the emotions and states they represented had been crammed in behind her eyelids. So a stormy relationship with him. They share a flat in the early 90s. The third one is Alejandro, who's a kind of, well, he does play tambourine in a band and dances, but this is her biggest sort of sexually charged relationship of her life. She absolutely falls for him. She's going out with a rather steady sort of government worker, I think, at the point. But anyway, this guy blows her away and they have an explosive sexual relationship that was never going to last.
Yeah.
And she knew it was never going to last. But actually, she occasionally wishes maybe or fantasizes about what would have happened if it had. And then the fourth section is Birgit, who's her mother.
Yeah. Which we don't really know at the beginning, and then we find out. It's amazing.
We find out in about 4 pages into it, and it is a moment.
But by that point, she's sort of described her as this like she's nothing like a mother.
No, and so this is a woman whose life has been completely defined by anxiety because of a trauma in her past, and possibly, a couple of traumas in her past, and an amazing description of what it's like to live with anxiety.
Yeah,
and
God.
So the question is, so she just describes these 4 separate relationships and separate people, and I think, why? Who's the book about? At the end, is the book about those 4 people, or is it in fact about the narrator? And she says, when she's talking about Joanna's words being part of her, I suppose that is the core of every relationship, and the reason that in some sense no relationship ever ends. And also, that's all there is to the self, or the so-called self, traces of the people we rub up against. And I do think that idea that all the people you've ever known and all the relationship you've ever had sort of coexist all the time is not just when you're in fever. I mean, if I put on my iTunes playlist, which dots around 40 odd years of music, all the people I've ever known are just all there.
How do you mean?
So I hear that song and I immediately think of that time with that person.
Oh, yeah.
And then you hear that song and you're immediately there with that person. And they're still all there. No relationship ever ends, I think, is And not even just listening to music. If you're walking around, sometimes you see something or think of something, and you know exactly the person from your past that you want to tell that to.
Hmm.
And you might not even see them or know them anymore. So that idea of all your relationships just all being there all the time, I think it's terrific. And also I think it's a brilliantly written book. And I really liked it. What did you reckon?
Do you know what? I think so. It is brilliant. And I, again, had this really weird experience of reading it with a fever, and it sets up on the premise of a fever. But I think I had this question in my mind while I was reading because, you're getting ostensibly this account of a person, but also of these four central people in her life. And I wasn't sure. And this is, I'm saying this as I say this, I really enjoyed reading this book. I kind of wasn't sure what the book was for. And I had this massive philosophical debate in my head about whether it should have a use, or whether that was quite a kind of materialistic way to think about a novel, or whether it was just offering me a different kind of worldview or a way of looking, a way of gathering a life. Because I couldn't quite say at the end what I'd actually learned about our narrator. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
no, it sort of does. I quoted that bit where she says,
Yeah.
we're made up of the people we rub up against. She sort of isn't really. She's not particularly affected by a mother's anxiety, really. It doesn't
No.
seem. In fact, she more often defines herself against these people. She says, well, Joanna was like that.
Yeah.
She was very sort of forward looking. I'm more of a drifter. And Nikki was actually, crazy, and I'm not. We can talk about this as well, I think, when we come to what I'd rather not think about next, which is they're
Yes.
both quite random books in a way. But I think
I don't
I think they
know.
excuse that. I think they excuse their randomness, and I think in the case of the details, it's this. So this is when she's talking with Nikki, who's the, as I say, the more disturbed one, but still, good fun and interesting to be with when she's in good form, and her conversation's good. But she absolutely hates anecdotes. So this is the narrator talking about Nikki. In contrast to most people I've known in my life, she rarely told anecdotes with herself as the main character, or anecdotes she'd already told before, or anecdotes in general, since the nature of an anecdote, beginning, middle, and finale, contradicted Nikki's demand for complete authenticity. Ever since my friendship with Nikki, this has rubbed off on her, I think. I think of the anecdote as a form of chronic illness that attaches itself to some people, that compulsion to tell everything in the shape of a story,
Mm,
to turn life into a formula.
yeah.
And so I think this book is setting out to be an anti-anecdote. I mean, so that does mean it's random, but I think it's authentically random. I think I agree with Nikki and the narrator, at least when I'm reading this book, I do.
Yeah. It definitely gave me like a really good reset out of I suppose what I think should be given to me while I'm reading a novel. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? The other
Actually,
thing,
not quite as the answer to that.
oh, I mean, like, when you read the blurb, it says, in the throes of a fever, a woman casts her mind back to the past. In precise, vivid language, the stories of four important people who have shaped her life are revealed. 1,000 little memories from across a lifetime laid bare in vivid detail as her body temperature races. And I don't know why now reading this, but my mind leapt to, oh, okay, so I'm basically just going to know everything about the narrator because she's telling us about these anecdotes, but not quite anecdotes. And at the end, some grand lesson will be revealed to me, like she'll offer me some kernel of wisdom. But instead, I kind of suppose what I got was a way of accounting for a life.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree, but I think she has a sort of ghost. It ends in a graveyard, and it says, as far as the dead are concerned, chronology has no import, and all that matters
Mm,
are the details, the degree of density, the
yeah.
how and what, and everything to do with who. But you're right. You're right. That only confirms what we already know, that chronology is not how we experience life in a way. We're just surrounded by all the people we've ever known all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, let's have a clip from the book read by Dua Lipa, no less. And this is from the bit where the narrator first sees Alejandro, the guy who's about to blow his socks off, involved in this hurricane of unbelievable erotic love for a bit. And this is the first time she sees him, and she's in a bar called Fashing with her friend Sally. Oh, she's got it bad. I'm not quite sure what cigarette pants are, but otherwise that's a good extract.
They're like kind of straight leg but pleated. It's all right, James. The other thing though, and this this is another kind of like running theme in this podcast, is the fact that I'm a baby.
We've got more tales from Grandad coming up later, don't you worry.
Yeah. But the other thing about this book that I actually really enjoyed is that a lot of this is set sort of around the 90s, maybe like late 80s, 90s. There's this big kind of section about the turn of the millennium and a kind of like New Year's Eve party. And there are lots
Yeah,
of
what
moments.
did you do for the millennium there, Joe?
I was 3. So I was in bed, James.
It's time for me to look gloomily to the floor again.
But I thought while I was reading this that there was just this amazing air of a kind of only just, not even digitized, but an
No.
only just technologically apparent way of living. So there are a lot of passages, for example, about, watching MTV for the first time,
Yeah,
and that
that's
being
right, yeah.
like this kind of
Yeah,
weird, frantic.
Yeah, weird self-publicity. What the hell's this? What? But in fact,
Yeah.
this is the future.
Or of like the phone, the landline, not even the phone, but the landline sometimes being unplugged and shoved in the laundry basket.
The
So
landline or the phone, as we used to call it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, clearly. But you do know what I'm
Yeah,
talking
no, I
about.
do. No, I think pre-internet life is a big feature of this book. And also, I think it reminds me, in a way, of One Day in the David Nichols
Yeah,
World Conqueror, which is full of very precise references to what were particular fashions at what particular time. There's one bit where she's going out with a bloke who is trying to smoke like Nicolas Cage did in
yeah,
Wild at Heart. The bit you mentioned about MTV, the bit where she goes interrailing, which was a thing, and it's got young people in huge backpacks everywhere. They were gathered in little groups.
yeah,
Some had guitars or cassette players. I'll explain them later. Some had set out little meals with bread rolls and soft cheese and beers in front of them. Others leaned their backs against the wall as they slept or smoked. So yes, no, I liked it. Well, obviously I did, because
yeah,
it made me nostalgic. The one day aspect of the book as well.
yeah. I thought it was so great. I particularly enjoyed the kind of moment where she loses her mates at a music festival, and she's like, "Well, that's just me done for the
Yeah.
rest of this music festival." I was like, "Why are you done? Why don't you just text them?" Oh, you can't text them.
No, that's right. I think people could just disappear.
Yeah,
I mean, a couple of the people in this book just go,
yeah.
and she doesn't know where they are because she doesn't know where they are.
Yeah, I liked it a lot. I particularly enjoyed, there are a lot of moments in this book, but it becomes more pertinent with her mother about how sort of therapy speak didn't exist back then. So, you were just kind of like going through it, but you didn't have words like anxiety or trauma to hand.
Well, yeah, it wasn't quite that primitive. But she takes refuge in all the sorts of things that have now come through.
Yeah.
Crystals and signs of, and the Chinese powders that smelt like hay. Met with mediums, started drawing little circles over my forehead with her finger before I went to school in the morning. Yeah, all sorts of stuff. But she's also obsessed with the yin and yang symbol. And then the narrator notes quite dryly, always this yin-yang symbol, though I'd never heard a satisfying explanation of its significance. Almost 10 years later, I would travel by train through the Soviet Union and Mongolia to get to Peking, and during my 8 months in Southeast Asia, I never saw the yin-yang symbol used in any other context than a merchandise for tourists like my mother.
Yeah.
So it's very clear-eyed but affectionate. I think I do like this book a lot.
Yeah, I do too. So we should move on to our next book, which is What I'd Rather Not Think About, written by Jente Postuma and translated by Sarah Timmer-Harvey. Postuma is a Dutch writer. I actually don't know why I find this so hard to believe. We might come back to this later, but she's 49 years old. I thought this was a book written by a much younger person, but in fact she's got 3 other novels under her belt, and she's quite well acclaimed. She's won quite a lot of prizes. So that's on me. Maybe I'm being ageist.
Well, we will come back to that and your toxic ageism.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a bit about the book first, then?
Yes. What I'd rather not think about is given to us by a nameless narrator,
Oh,
again,
no,
same as the
narrator,
details,
no, indeed.
who has a twin brother who's taken his own life in a rather kind of Virginia Woolf fashion by walking into a river. Although I don't know whether his pockets are full of stones.
No, they are full of
They
stones.
are full of
He
stones.
cycles into a river with his pockets full of stones.
Good
actually, yeah.
Lord. But there's this very touching point midway through that I think sums up the book really well for me, that the narrator says, in When Women Are Friends, the play by Hannah van Wieringen, one of two characters said, "There aren't enough stories about how to deal with life after loss." For example, "I know everything about how a mother could murder her children," she said, "but nothing about what happens afterwards. In other words, how life continues, how people manage to get through it together. When this is the thing we're more likely to experience. Technically, there are more Tuesday afternoons where nothing really happens in a person's life, I mean."
That's very good, isn't it?
So we get, I suppose, we get three things, or at least I got three things as a reader from what I'd rather not think about. Um, Primarily, we get a kind of portrait of grief. We get that rather than meditating on the actual death itself, we get that very prolonged, lots of Tuesdays where nothing happens. I'm just thinking about my brother and I'm trying to make sense of his suicide. I'm thinking about all the moments where potentially I could have supported him more or said something or whatever. I'm now sleeping in his apartment that's across the square from where I live, and my boyfriend's really annoyed at me for doing it. Then secondarily, we get through this a portrait of her twin brother. We learn what he's like and why he's special. And I don't know about you, but I think Jente Postuma is really good at sort of making the idea of a depressive personality very accessible.
Mhm.
Because I think sometimes, if you're of a certain mindset, you kind of, it's a bit incomprehensible to you that someone should just be sad because they are sad or because they have that tendency, whether in a kind of biochemical sense or in a more mental sense. And she sort of, I wouldn't say rationalizes it, but she makes it so accessible and so understandable. We actually have a clip from one of our actor readings that I think highlights this really well. It's done by Anya Shalotra, and I think we should hear it now.
Yeah,
It's powerful
yeah,
stuff.
it is a strong passage, that, yeah.
Yeah. But we kind of, or at least I felt that I understood why he would have cycled into that river midway by the time we get midway through the book. And then the other thing we get, as you say, are all of our narrators' weird kind of obsessions, some of which are to do with death and tragedy. For example, she fixates a lot on 9/11, and particularly on the idea of people jumping from the towers and choosing to die rather than,
Also, there were two towers,
yes,
one of
there
whom
were,
was
they were twin
two
towers,
twin
and now
towers,
they're,
one slightly bigger than the other. Then when they collapsed, they sort of both collapsed.
yeah,
So when her brother dies, in a way, she's sort of collapsed as well. And when she
yeah.
goes to visit it again, there's one tower in its place. I mean, I'm making that sound a bit more crudely symbolic than it is. I think that works quite well.
No, it does work really well. So another one of her fixations is a doctor called Mengele who used to experiment on twins in
Yeah. So
Auschwitz.
like with the twin towers, she keeps sort of coming back to it. She'll
Yeah,
have some memories, and then she'll start talking about Mengele again,
yeah,
the twin towers again, memories again.
yeah,
So it is all broken up quite randomly. I thought that was quite brave because so she's really comparing her suffering in a way to almost Holocausty stuff. And so she's saying, "I was ashamed of the hours I'd lost searching for stories of Holocaust survivors and the way I used the great suffering of others to process my minor grievances."
yeah. Oh, it's the
So
same
she's
with nine
aware, but no,
eleven.
but she's aware of it. But well, two things. First of all, their therapist, who is actually by coincidence the child of Holocaust
Yeah.
survivors, um, says there is no hierarchy of suffering,
Yes.
and I sort of think that it's quite brave for her to say, "Actually, I felt as bad because I think one of the things that happens during this much pain is a sort of lack of proportion. So
Mm,
nobody has ever suffered like I'm suffering now.
mm,
Seems to be a perfectly it's not what you should think,
mm.
but it might be what you do think
Yeah.
when you're in this level of pain." And so I thought that was brave, foolhardy
I thought it
maybe,
was brilliant.
and rather brilliant, yeah.
Because I
Uh,
mean, I think you can trust the reader to have sort of to take on the role of the therapist in the way, or maybe to even be a bit stricter and say, "On, come on now, you weren't in Auschwitz," but it still makes sense. You would still understand why she doesn't have a sense of proportion in relation to her
Yeah.
grief, because there are all of these really moving accounts of, as I said, she lives across the square from her brother's apartment, and of her just essentially haunting it, just
Yeah.
haunting it like a ghost.
I mean, is
Um,
there something creepy about their relationship?
I how do you mean?
Well, he gives their well, the fact that they spend all their time together when they move to Amsterdam even, and then he gives a speech at her wedding, which I think is so she marries in the end her boyfriend Leo,
Yes.
and I think the speech he makes there is brilliant because it's affectionate and touching, almost a bit hostile and almost a bit creepy, all at the same time, which is what it seems to be. It is so. My brother at my wedding, my brother said he knew of no one more like him than I was. The crowd had to laugh at that. He said it felt good to see me so happy with Leo, but he was also slightly concerned about himself and how he would fare without me. She's always been there, he said, even when I didn't want her to be. Everyone laughed again. You know what I mean? There's
Do you know what this is reminding me of now is her account of when they are both 8 years old, and her twin brother is gay, and they both fall in love with the same boy, Hans. And also at some point they fall in love with the TV presenter as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
So do you know what? I maybe this says more about me than about the book, but I didn't find it creepy because I think sort of what all of this does is it kind of makes there's a point where her brother begins to separate himself very physically from her. So one of the things that they were always supposed to do together was to go to New York
Yeah.
and spend a year in New York, and instead he goes to Brazil.
He lets her go on her own.
Yeah.
And sort of crushing it's on their 28th birthday. And
Yes,
their dad
has just left them a load of money.
yeah, left them a load of money, but he left them to inherit it when he was 28 because the dad's theory was that it's when you're 28 that you become an adult.
Yes.
The brother seems to respond to becoming an adult by saying, "We spent too much time together. This is getting out of hand,"
Yeah.
and this obviously crushes her.
Yes. But I thought those moments, especially early on in childhood where she's talking about their childhood, were less kind of creepy. It was more like they were just one person and they had, the same desires, the same crushes, they wanted to maybe they were not exactly the same because I think she does that very classic sibling thing of saying, he was better than me, he was more outspoken than me, he was, I followed wherever he went. But they are
He was the slightly taller tower.
yes. Um, but it makes that kind of separation that occurs between the two of them, even when they're living across the square from each other, but somehow never visit each other anyway, all the more painful. And I also think there's a way that you begin to understand a kind of depressive, her brother's depressive mentality
Yeah.
through that separation.
What about the sort of randomness? So we've given some hint of it, but
Mm.
but not quite. So there's one bit where we'll just have a little section. So there's no section longer than 2 or 3 pages. Some are just a few lines. So we'll just have a bit where the brother explains that what proportion of pigs are born without anuses,
Yeah.
or
Great conversation, actually.
yeah,
I
okay,
really enjoyed
or
that.
you'll remember his dad's impression of a Dutch film critic.
Yeah.
There's a bit of Donald Trump in there. I didn't realize his reaction to 9/11 was to say, "Hurrah! I've now got the biggest building in this part of New York."
Yeah.
But she mentions that. But I suppose, as in the details, where I was trying to argue that the randomness was kind of the point because she's trying to avoid anecdotes as a simple way. I think the same is here. Only this time there's a different reason. She again slightly randomly remembers, or maybe not randomly in this case, an interview with James Coetzee, the novelist,
Yes.
on television, interviewed by an apparently famous Dutch interviewer, who says, despite Coetzee's discomfort, he kept questioning him, seeking the one recollection that would be a perfect metaphor for beauty and consolation, the one anecdote that would delineate everything more clearly than 100 theories could. So I think what she's doing in this book is obviously just searching for that here, there. Is it there? Is that the perfect anecdote? Will that explain it? Will that tell me why my brother died? Will that unlock this mystery? And
Yeah.
that's almost frantic, but just the constant search rather than frantic search.
Yes. Although I think partially as well, what she's potentially trying to do with all these fragments is sort of piece herself back together as a new person who doesn't have a brother anymore. Because there was this really heartbreaking moment where she says about her and her brother, sometimes we fought about our memories. Which memory belonged to whom? In any case, I was sure it had been me, not my brother, who had driven our mother's car through the neighbour's hedge, and that I was the one who won a medal at the school marbles tournament. Extensive research has shown that twins are more likely to claim each other's memories, and yet they tend not to ascribe their own memories to each other. This is why I found it strange when my brother insisted it was me who had swallowed our mother's last 3 sleeping pills in one gulp at 14, when I am certain it was him. He'd slept through the night and right through the following day, and I had to ride all the way to school on my own. What's happening is this kind of archiving in a way, which now, maybe this is too neat.
Go on, go for
Maybe
it.
I'm going
We're
to
coming to the
tie
end
this
now, so,
episode up in a
that'd be beautiful.
bow.
We're coming to the end of the episode, so yeah, a neat bow. What do we go for? Go for it.
But it does make me think of Katerina sifting through the boxes at the beginning of Kairos.
Very much so.
Going through her memories of Hans and, sort of giving them to us, shaping them so that gradually they make sense.
Actually, this is not over neat. They're all archival books in a way.
They are.
I mean, but Kairos has got that extra dimension that people, after the fall of the wall, people found that their Stasi archives and sort of went through them, and we get a bit of that towards the end of the book, and where we won't spoil that. But yeah, but in a way, yes, all these people are going through archives in either literal or otherwise. Oh, sorry, just one less. So why were you surprised that she was so young rather than so old?
Because something that we haven't spoken about in this book is that it's very funny. And I'm not saying that if you're over the age of like 30 you can't be funny, but I thought it was such a weirdly kind of Gen Z kind of humor, where it was maybe not quite anti-humor, but there was this kind of deeply ironic tone to the way certain lines were delivered, and it was almost, I mean,
yes, no,
maybe it's because the narrator is so chronically online, she's always Googling, but it had this kind of very pithy Twitter. It is much better than Twitter, but the kind of pithiness of it, and maybe this kind of fragmentedness, which I find in a lot more kind of, zillennial and Gen Z books, felt very, very young to me.
Oh, that's interesting. So, okay, well, that's what I'd rather not think about by Genta Postuma. So we've done the 3 archival books, as we've now decided they are.
Yes.
What do you want to keep your powder dry for what you want to win overall, or do you want to say what your favourite of those 3 is?
I will keep my powder dry for the winner overall, because it's not fair to say that until we've discussed our Korean and South American books. Out of these 3, this sounds a bit dodgy, but even though they are quite different in style and they take place at different points in time and they're about very distinct narrators, they are also incredibly similar books. They've sort of melted into my mind as sort of like one big kind of like, Northern European block. I think I was most impressed by Kairos, because it's just the style of it is so good. It made me want to listen to all the music that was mentioned, and it put me in a very particular time and place. And I'm always endlessly intrigued by this idea of, is it a romance with politics attached, or is it a political novel with romance attached? But that being said, to me, these 3 books might actually just be equally on par in their very separate ways.
I must say, I'm really pleased I'm not a judge. This is really hard.
No, but wait, what's your favourite?
Of these 3, probably Kairos, but I really like the details. I might argue when we come to the big showdown next week is the one of maybe 2 books on this list that gets better and better. I think.
What's the other one?
Not a River.
I agree with Not a River.
I think a few of the others either slightly run out of steam, or or either get worse.
Yeah.
But you've got the point. But I explained about Kairos. I thought the second half is too relentless and long, even if deliberate. I don't think what I'd rather not think about. We've got the idea by the time it ends. The details. It's the final chapter on her mother is unbelievably good. That's the one that gets bigger and bigger, and that's one of the novels I don't think is front loaded on this shortlist. Maybe we'll leave it there for part 1 of our look at the 2024 International Booker Prize shortlist. Join us in a fortnight for part 2, when we'll be introducing, discussing, and possibly even arguing about Not a River by Selva Almada, translated by Annie McDermott, Crooked Plough by Itamar Vieira Jr., translated by Johnny Lorenz. Meta 2-10 by Hwan Sok Young, translated by Sora Kim Russell. And Young Jai Josephine Bai. And for more on this year's International Booker Prize shortlist, please visit the Booker Prize's website, where among much else you can find the full versions of the films of actors reading from the books that we heard today, plus the 3 that we'll be discussing next time in their full versions. They're also available on YouTube.
In the meantime, of course, please don't forget to rate and review this podcast.
You can also follow the book prizes on X, TikTok, Instagram and Facebook. And until next time, goodbye.
Bye. The Booker Prize podcast is hosted by me, Jo Hamier, and by James Walton. It is produced and edited by Kevin Riolo, and the executive producer is John Davenport. It is a Daddy's Super Yacht production for the Booker Prizes.